Greetings, students. I apologize for not recording the conference today. Thus, I am sort of summarizing what I've went over through this video. Hopefully, it will suffice. Um, really, I presented was simply a review of Othello and how it relates to two particular theories that we discussed in class. So the assignment is asking you to look at Othello first as a tragedy, and secondly through some binary opposite perspectives, right? So the first viewpoint deals with formalism. Formalism being a literary theory back in the early 20th century by the Russians who focused merely on the text, and in particular the form of the text. What made a text a literary text as opposed to, say, common speech? And so it investigated works of the literary form. In other words, what makes a literary work a poem, what makes it a play, what makes it a fictive narrative. And that's called the literalness or the literariness of the text itself. And part of that notion of the formalism deals with how they view the text itself and not any other outside forces. And so when you're looking at the first part of the assignment, it asks you in the introduction not only to summarize the play, so in other words, mention Othello, mention the playwright William Shakespeare. You could easily summarize the play within the first three sentences. But then it asks of you to describe what makes the play a tragedy. There you're looking at the form of the work and what constitutes this work as a particular tragedy. Not just what makes it a play as opposed to a poem, but also what makes it a tragedy as opposed to a comedy. And so I wanted you to look at Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle outlines exactly what elements are needed in order to make a work a tragedy. Don't necessarily focus on the 6 elements of a tragedy. Those are plot, character, diction, deed or act, spectacle or song, because all of those elements can be found in comedies. What makes the Othello a work of tragedy is the complex plot, which outlines a narrative that has a reversal of things, which is called the peripeteia, a reversal of the action, and the recognition or the discovery of the self, agnosis, where the main character, the protagonist, identifies himself and recognizes his tragic fate, right? And so in the introduction of the assignments, it's asking you to use a formalist reading of the text by identifying those moments of peripeteia and agnosis. Again, the purpose of peripeteia and agnosis is so that the audience can have fear and pity toward the protagonist, and that's how that catharsis is what identifies how the audience identifies that character as tragic, right? And again, all of that is formalism. All of that is looking at the elements of the text and deducing why this is a literary work of tragedy as opposed to, say, common speech. Okay. The second part, after the introduction, is dealing with binary opposites, and this is where structuralism comes in. So both formalism and structuralism focuses on the text itself. It doesn't identify or it doesn't rely on historical findings of the time, what the Elizabethan age was during Shakespearean writing of Othello. That would be left up to new historicists to decipher. It wasn't interested in the biography of William Shakespeare. That would be biographical criticism. Instead, both formalism and structuralism just simply look at the text itself. And so it's from the text that one does a close reading, which is what the new critics called, in order to figure out or to interpret the elements of the play. Okay, so formalism is simply doing a close reading of the text and identifying the text as literary, as opposed to um, common speech. Um, the structuralism looks at a text in terms of the structure of the play, most of the time, in terms of binary opposites. Um, Now, I should mention that all these theories, formalism and structuralism, is a lot more complex than simply binary opposites, or even Aristotle's Poetics, identifiable elements that you could find in these particular literary works. Um, both formalism and structuralism really focuses on language and how language is used within the narrative itself. Um, if you're a linguist, or you were into philology, which was my studies back in Santa Barbara, then I would go more into detail about what makes up a sign, what makes up words, how you differentiate a certain word from another word, simply by phonetics. But again, all of that, if you're really interested in investigating or becoming a formalist or a structuralist, you would go into more detail about the linguistics or the language of the text itself. For us right now, as an introduction, I'm simply looking at formalism and structuralism in a very basic way. Okay, so formalism focuses on the literariness of the text, focuses on what makes a text literary as opposed to common speech. A structuralist looks at the structure of the text in its social context, in particular, these ideologies of binary opposites. Now, I should mention that when we're looking at binary opposites, the literary text is filled with binary opposite because it relies so much on conflict, right? So one binary opposite would be protagonist and antagonist, the hero and the enemy. Another binary opposite would be light and dark, or good and evil, right? Which is the centerpiece of morality. So all those binary opposites is part of the structural framework of the literary text. The assignment is asking you to look at the play in a structural analysis in terms of race and gender. So we're dealing into race theory or post-colonialism or colonialist theory, and gender studies, be it feminism, queer theory, male studies. So if we just take race and race theory, as well as post-colonialism, deals with this type of structural analysis that one does within the text. And so looking at Othello, you notice that there is definitely a racial bias between the Venetians toward Othello, who happens to be a Moor. And so you're dealing with the European self, or the European or Western viewpoint, as opposed to the non-Western viewpoint. In this case, Othello would be the colonized other. Now, I should mention that Othello is not necessarily a colonized other. He was captured from the Barbary coast, northern Africa, and brought toward Venice in order to fight in the army. He was a slave. And so in many ways, Othello is like the African slaves of the American West, which the colonists went over, took people from Africa and made them into slaves in the colonies. And again, all of that is part of this idea of a structural binary, right? A colonized other would be closer to the indigenous populations, the Native Americans, whose land was taken by the colonists, right? In any case, you still have a Western self and a viewpoint of the non-Western other found in these texts. And I want you to focus on Barmentino, who happens to be Desdemona's father, as Othello's father-in-law, and then Othello. This concept of both race and gender, I'll speak about shortly on how it creates an ideology that's sort of set in stone. But the first part of your essay will focus on a structural analysis in terms of race or race studies. The second part deals with structural analysis in terms of gender, in this case, male versus female. And in a patriarchal society, the male is the self, and the female is the other, right? As you can see with Iago and Amelia. So both structural analysis deals with that binary opposites in terms of race and gender, and you will discover other binary opposites in terms of class, say, one of royalty as opposed to the peasant class in Shakespearean times. Now, the interesting thing about structuralism is that it doesn't try and make a statement that the binary opposites are bad. The binary opposites has biases within it. In other words, it always assumes that one side is favored over another side. So in a Western context, the Westerner or the Venetian is favored over the Moor or the colonized other. In a patriarchal society, you have the male always more privileged than the female, who's subservient to the husband. And so in a structural analysis, one is not trying to destroy the structure or even criticize the structure. All it does is identify that there are cultural biases within the structure itself. And by making that known, we could come up with our own opinions of why such structural binaries and structural biases are bad. But it's not trying to say that in many ways that we want to disrupt the ideology or get rid of it. If anything, within the text itself, it can subvert the ideology. But in many ways, the structural ideologies that form these binary opposites, that creates these biases, is what drives the institutions. That's why you have institutionalized racism and institutionalized sexism, even in a society today where we think of ourselves as beyond race and beyond gender. Even in a multicultural society where the minorities outnumber the majority, we still see racism today. Even in a society that believes in gender fluidity, we still see biases when it comes to sexist workplace conditions and equal rights. And so within these institutions, there are these biases that still remain, and structuralism simply recognizes them. When we get into, later on in the course, when we get into post-structuralism and deconstruction, that's when there will be more of a progressive viewpoint that we could go beyond race and beyond gender by considering these racial and sexual biases as not, well, in Derrida's term, is not centered. It never existed. The center never existed. In other words, these institutional biases of race and sex was created by a patriarchal society or a Western-based society that has an ideology that simply doesn't exist. Right? There's no absolute truth within these biases. It was created so that an institution can thrive. And deconstruction and post-structuralism attempts to decentralize the institutional biases to give voice to the other. But again, we'll get there in the later part of the course. Right now, I'm just interested in you identifying the structural biases, structural binaries that create these biases, and be able to analyze the text as such, right? So when you read something like Othello, sure, you could call Shakespeare as sexist or racist, but in the end, it's really the institution that's being criticized. Someone like Shakespeare is simply a product, or in Michel Foucault's viewpoint, a function of the cultural institutionalized binary oppositions that create such biases to begin with. I do want to go back to talk a little bit about Othello as a character. So Othello himself is obviously a colonized other, but in the sense that he was brought over from northern Africa to fight for the Venetian army. But what's interesting thing about Othello is that he does, even though he's recognized as the other because of the color of his skin, he adopts a lot of the Western viewpoints. He speaks Venetian. It should be Italian, but in Shakespeare time, Shakespeare's writing, it's obviously English. He believes in the Christian God as opposed to a Muslim God, which he would have been brought up in the Middle East. He even refers to people of the Middle East, which again he is of the Near East, Northern Africa, the Barbary Coast, as part of a lower class or lower third world civilian or third world resident citizen, and so he's completely assimilated to the Western viewpoint. And as a result, that's part of his tragedy. Is that he can only identifies himself in the end as the other. It doesn't matter how well he knows the language. Doesn't matter how high he gets up to the Venetian ranks in the army. He's always going to be remarked as the Moor. In Othello, looking at Othello through a gender lens, he obviously loves Desdemona, but treats her as a subservient to him. So only his viewpoint as a jealous male matters, as opposed to her viewpoint as this innocent female. And so he's unwilling to even listen to Desdemona's pleas of innocence. And even in the end, she gives in and says, "No, I deserve this. There's nothing. This is part of a larger tragedy." So she falls victim to playing that patriarchal, privileged viewpoint. And so, in many ways, that structural binary of patriarchal biases toward the female exists in the play itself. As part of the conclusion, is simply asking you how to make what makes Othello a relevant play today. In other words, why is it that we still have elements of racism and sexism in society? And the obvious answer is yes. It doesn't matter how advanced we are in the society, we still fall back on these cultural biases because of the institution that elevates these ideologies to begin with. Again, the structural binaries have always been there and has even been thriving, even in such an advanced society as in the 21st century, because of these institutions that embrace these biased ideologies. When we start looking at post-structuralism and deconstruction, we'll definitely see a breakdown of the biases. But for now, it's just simply a matter of identification. So that's it. Those again are the elements of the assignment. I just simply wanted to go through those two theories, formalism and structuralism, to make sure you understand them clearly before we start to deconstruct them. Next week, we'll be looking at psychoanalysis. And in those theories, and I'm talking about not only just Freudian psychoanalysis, but Jungian and Lacanian. I want to talk about the binary opposites of the conscious and unconscious minds. Again, if you look at psychoanalysis, there's elements of sexism in it because of the patriarchal viewpoint that's part of that bias. And nevertheless, it's easier to understand these literary theories if you consider that structural approach of binary opposites found in those theories. So I'm going to have this taped, recorded, and posted online for you to view. Next week, I swear, I'll actually record the conference So you have that for viewpoint. If any, in any case, hopefully you'll find the lecture today meaningful. If you have any questions concerning your papers, or even of the theories themselves, feel free to email or message me. I will see you next week.